in the long memory of Westeros. Some moments are remembered, not for what happened, but for what almost did. The execution of Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell, is often treated as one of those fixed points in history, as inevitable as winter itself. Yet history, like sleep, is shaped by small decisions made in quiet rooms, by pauses between words, by the weight of conscience resting on a single human choice. This is a meditation on such a pause, a slow unfolding of a world in which honor was not punished immediately, but rewarded with responsibility, a world in which the Iron Throne did not pass to cruelty or calculation, but to restraint, duty, and a northern sense of consequence. Tonight we do not ask how wars are won, but how they are prevented. We do not rush toward battles but linger in council chambers, in cold keeps, and in the uneasy silence that follows a just man's ascent to absolute power. This is not a tale of triumph. It is an examination of stability, sacrifice, and the quiet cost of doing what is right. This is a law for sleep. This is a history of what might have been in the world of Game of Thrones, inspired by the writings of George R.R. Martin. History often disguises its turning points as formalities. They appear as ceremonies, as public rituals meant to affirm what power has already decided. In the memory of King's Landing, the gathering before the great sept of Baelor was intended to be such a moment, a spectacle of submission, an orderly conclusion to a political inconvenience, and a lesson delivered to the realm in clear and uncomplicated terms. Yet even the most carefully staged moments contain variables that cannot be entirely controlled. The square before the sept was heavy with late summer heat, the kind that pressed against stone and skin alike, muting sound and slowing thought. The crowd gathered not in frenzy, but in a subdued anticipation that bordered on discomfort. Executions were not unusual in the capital, but this one carried a different gravity. The man brought forth was not a criminal in the common sense, nor a rebel whose name inspired anger. He was Ned Stark, a warden of the North, former hand of the king, and a figure whose reputation had been shaped by restraint rather than ambition. When he was made to kneel, it was not his posture that unsettled the onlookers, but his silence. Ned Stark had never been a man of performative defiance. His resistance had always been quieter, embedded in refusal rather than confrontation. Even now, stripped of rank and authority, he carried himself not as a defeated enemy, but as someone who had already weighed the outcome and found no alternative he could accept. Above him, the structures of power waited to speak. The Iron Throne itself was absent, distant within the Red Keep, but its presence lingered in every banner, every armored guard, every word that would soon be spoken in its name. The boy king, Joffrey Baratheon, stood elevated, framed by gold and crimson. He was young enough that the weight of his crown appeared almost theoretical, an ornament rather than a burden. His authority, though absolute in form, was still being tested in practice. It was expected that this test would be passed with blood. The script was simple, a confession extracted through fear, a sentence delivered with confidence, a blade falling to the approval of the crowd, order restored through finality. But history does not always respond well to simplicity. When Ned Stark spoke, his voice carried across the square without force. He did not embellish his words. He did not argue. He confessed, as he had been instructed, to treason against the crown. Yet even in submission, there was an unmistakable restraint. His confession was shaped less like an admission of guilt and more like an acceptance of consequence. It was not the voice of a man begging for life, but of one choosing stability over truth, sacrificing his name to preserve his daughters, and perhaps the realm. This distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. The Seven Kingdoms had known many kings, but few transitions of power had felt as quietly dissonant as this one. When Ned Stark was summoned back to King's Landing, not as a prisoner, nor as a condemned man bound for the wall, but as the realm's reluctant stabilizer, the city responded not with celebration, but with a subdued and watchful silence. Power had changed hands without the usual punctuation of blood, and that absence unsettled those who depended upon spectacle to understand authority. The Iron Throne was not designed for comfort. Its jagged silhouette rose from the throne room like a warning rather than an invitation. Forged from swords meant to remind its occupant that rule was never meant to be easy. For generations, kings had attempted to master it through intimidation or indulgence. Ned Stark approached it differently, but he did not seek to dominate the throne. He treated it as a burden to be endured rather than a symbol to be wielded. This distinction was immediately evident. The court, accustomed to rapid judgments and dramatic pronouncements, found itself slowed by a king who preferred deliberation to impulse. Ned Stark spoke less than expected. When he did, his words were measured, often cautious, and rarely absolute. To the lords of the South, this restraint read initially as uncertainty. They mistook patience for hesitation, silence for ignorance. Yet beneath this quiet demeanor lay a worldview shaped by northern winters and long memories. An understanding that decisions made too quickly often required blood to undo. Culturally, the divide was stark. The North had always existed at a remove from the rhythms of King's Landing. Where the South prized display, the North valued endurance. Where the capital thrived on intrigue, Winterfell had survived on clarity. Ned Stark did not attempt to reconcile these differences through force. Instead, he allowed the contrast to remain visible, even uncomfortable. In doing so, he altered the tone of governance itself. The first notable change was the court's atmosphere. Laughter grew rarer, not from fear, but from uncertainty. Flattery lost its efficacy. Courtiers accustomed to reading moods and exploiting vanity found little traction in a king unmoved by praise or insult. Ned Stark did not reward cleverness when it came at the expense of truth. He asked questions that demanded substance, not performance. Over time, those who thrived solely on manipulation found themselves increasingly peripheral. This was not reform by decree. It was reform by inertia. The small council, long accustomed to steering the crown through suggestion and omission, found itself constrained by transparency. Matters once handled privately were brought into open discussion. Disagreements were permitted, even encouraged, but decisions were recorded, justified, and remembered. This insistence on accountability was subtle but corrosive to corruption. Schemes thrive in shadows. Ned Stark, without theatrics, reduced those shadows simply by refusing to operate within them. Yet the southern lords did not surrender influence easily. They tested him through tradition, through appeals to precedent and convenience. They invoked the necessity of swift punishment, the importance of appearing strong. Ned listened. He always listened. And then, often, he chose restraint. Punishments were not eliminated, but they were contextualized. Crimes were weighed not only against law, but against circumstance. Mercy was no longer accepted. Reform, in Westeros, had traditionally arrived with noise. It came in the form of purges, public trials, and banners raised or burned. Change announced itself through spectacle, so that no one could mistake its source. Under Ned Stark, the realm encountered something unfamiliar. Reform that did not ask to be witnessed. There were no proclamations etched in marble. No sweeping declarations meant to define an era. Instead, change emerged through procedure, through habit, and through the slow recalibration of expectation. It was this very subtlety that made the early months of his rule difficult to interpret for those accustomed to drama. Many did not realize reform was underway until they found themselves constrained by it. The first adjustments occurred within the law itself. Ned Stark did not rewrite the codes of the Seven Kingdoms, and he respected precedent, perhaps more than was wise. But he altered how those codes were applied. Punishment, long used as a display of royal will, was returned to its original purpose: correction and deterrence rather than intimidation. Sentences were standardized. Crimes were contextualized. The same offense no longer yielded wildly different outcomes based solely on proximity to power. This consistency unsettled the court. Nobles who had relied on influence to soften consequences discovered that influence now required explanation. Appeals were no longer private conversations, but recorded discussions. Decisions were documented, not merely remembered. This practice, mundane as it seemed, eroded the informal networks that had thrived on ambiguity. When reasoning is written down, it becomes harder to disguise self-interest as necessity. Nowhere was this shift more evident than in the handling of accusations. Under previous reigns, accusation itself often functioned as punishment. To be named was to be weakened. Ned Stark rejected this logic. Allegations were investigated quietly before they were acted upon. This restraint denied opportunists the satisfaction of immediate damage. It also frustrated those who believed that fear was an efficient tool. The king accepted this frustration as a cost worth paying. The small council, once a chamber of maneuvering, began to resemble an institution again. Meetings grew longer, discussions more methodical, decisions less impulsive. Ned Stark did not dominate these sessions. He allowed disagreement, even when it slowed progress. This tolerance did not come from indecision, but from a belief that governance benefited from friction. When conclusions were reached, they carried weight precisely because dissent had been permitted. Some councillors adapted, others withdrew. The removal of informal privilege proved more effective than dismissal. Without public disgrace, there was no martyrdom. Without visible conflict, there was little to rally around. Influence diminished quietly, and those who lost it often could not identify the moment it slipped away. Beyond the court, the reforms reached the realm through intermediaries. Magistrates were instructed to report not only verdicts, but patterns. Repeated disputes between the same houses were flagged for mediation rather than punishment. Long-standing grievances, once ignored because they lacked strategic value, were addressed incrementally. This approach did not resolve every conflict, but it slowed their escalation. Power, when stripped of spectacle, does not vanish. It retreats, consolidates, and waits. House Lannister had long understood this truth. Their strength had never rested solely in swords or banners, but in proximity, to the crown, to coin, to consequence. Under previous kings, this proximity had functioned as immunity. Under Ned Stark, it became a liability. The first sign of change was not confrontation, but distance. The king did not exclude the Lannisters from court. That would have been too visible, too abrupt. Instead, he altered the conditions under which influence could be exercised. Private audiences became rare. Decisions once settled in corridors were redirected to chambers where witnesses were present and records kept. What had once been leverage became exposure. For Cersei Lannister, this shift was deeply unsettling, as she had ruled not through decree, but through access. The machinery of the crown had been familiar to her, its weaknesses known, its dependencies cultivated. Ned Stark did not challenge her authority directly. He simply stopped responding to it in expected ways. Requests were acknowledged, delayed, rerouted. Favor was replaced with procedure. This erosion was difficult to contest openly. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been denied outright. Yet each day, her reach shortened. The court noticed. Whispers began to circulate, not of downfall, but of uncertainty. The Lannisters were still present, still wealthy, still feared. But fear alone could not compel a king who did not react to it. The lion roared less often, not because it had grown weaker, but because its roar no longer guaranteed response. At the center of this recalibration stood Jaime Lannister, whose position embodied the tension of the moment. As a member of the Kingsguard, Jaime was sworn to protect the king, bound by oath rather than ambition. Under earlier regimes, this role had existed in uneasy balance with his family loyalties. Ned Stark approached this contradiction without accusation. He neither provoked nor pardoned. Instead, he clarified expectation. Oaths were to be honored not symbolically, but functionally. The Kingsguard was reminded, quietly but firmly, that proximity to power demanded restraint rather than indulgence. Jaime adapted, outwardly. He fulfilled his duties. He remained present. Yet something had shifted. The casual impunity once afforded him no longer existed. Actions were observed, patterns noted. This was not punishment. It was visibility. And visibility, for those accustomed to moving unexamined, felt like constraint. The greatest adjustment came not through individuals, but through finances. House Lannister's true strength had always been its gold. The crown's debts, accumulated over years of excess, had granted the family enormous leverage. Ned Stark addressed this not with accusation, but with accounting. Audits were conducted. Repayment schedules proposed. New expenditures were scrutinized. The crown did not default, but it did renegotiate. Gold, once a chain binding the throne, became a ledger entry. This transformation was deeply destabilizing to the old order. Influence that had been informal was forced into structure. Loans became contracts. Contracts invited terms. Terms invited limitation. The Lannisters remained wealthy, but their wealth no longer translated seamlessly into command. Resistance came, but it was muted. To challenge the king openly would require justification, and justification demanded transparency. The Lannisters, masters of implication and pressure, found themselves ill-suited to this terrain. Every protest risked revealing more than it concealed. Even Tywin Lannister, from his seat at Casterly Rock, recognized the danger. Tywin did not act hastily. He understood that Ned Stark's approach was not an attack, but a reordering. There were no enemies to confront, no battles to win. The strategy was denial of advantage, and such strategies are difficult to counter without appearing guilty of the very excess they remove. So Tywin waited. In the meantime, the realm adjusted to a quieter balance of power. House Lannister remained formidable, but no longer untouchable. Their authority, once assumed, now required justification like any other. This normalization was perhaps the most profound reform of all. The lion had not been slain. Fear did not disappear from King's Landing. It changed its object. For generations, the small council had operated under a familiar anxiety, the fear of royal displeasure, sudden and often arbitrary. Kings had ruled by mood as much as mandate, and survival depended on anticipation, on knowing which words to withhold, which truths to soften, which silences to maintain. Under Ned Stark, that form of fear lost its relevance. In its place emerged something quieter, and for many, far more unsettling. The council began to fear being understood. Ned Stark did not preside as a tyrant or a visionary. He presided as an auditor of conscience. Meetings were no longer performances staged for approval, but examinations of logic. Proposals were asked not merely what they would accomplish, but why they were necessary and who would bear their cost. Answers that relied on tradition or convenience found little purchase. What mattered was coherence. This expectation reshaped the dynamics of the chamber. The master of coin, Peter Baelish, had thrived in ambiguity. His genius lay in complexity, in creating systems so interwoven that only he appeared capable of managing them. Ned Stark did not accuse him of wrongdoing. He simply asked him to explain, slowly, thoroughly, and in the presence of others. The effect was disarming. What had once been impressive now appeared fragile. Each clarification removed a layer of mystique. Each explanation invited scrutiny. Peter Baelish adapted, as he always did. But adaptation required effort. Effort, over time, revealed intent. The more the system was understood, the less indispensable its architect appeared. Across the table sat Varys, whose relationship with fear was altogether different. Varys had never feared punishment. He feared instability. Chaos disrupted information networks, and information was his domain. Ned Stark's rule, methodical and restrained, created an environment that Varys found unexpectedly conducive. Secrets still existed, but they mattered less. When power is predictable, whispers lose some of their urgency. This did not render Varys obsolete. It changed his function. He became less a manipulator and more an archivist of threat. Information was gathered not to steer the king, but to prepare him. Ned Stark listened carefully, but he did not act reflexively. Many dangers were noted and left untouched, not from negligence, but from a calculated refusal to overreact. This restraint unsettled the council, like they had grown accustomed to motion. Plots answered with counterplots, rumors with arrests. Now silence often followed revelation. This silence was not dismissal. It was deliberation. And deliberation, when prolonged, forced those who benefited from urgency to confront the limits of their influence. The Lord Commander of the Kingsguard attended more frequently, not as ornament, but as witness. Military considerations. For most of the Seven Kingdoms, the wall existed as an abstraction. It was spoken of in oaths and histories, invoked in old stories, meant to frighten children or flatter the North, but rarely considered in the practical rhythms of governance. It marked an edge rather than a responsibility. South of the neck, it was easier to imagine the wall as eternal, unchanging, and therefore irrelevant. Under Ned Stark, that assumption quietly dissolved. The king's relationship with the wall was not sentimental. It was shaped by memory. He had stood beneath its shadow before, felt the cold that seeped into stone and bone alike, and understood what it meant to ask men to hold a line that offered no glory and little reward. To him, the wall was not merely a boundary. It was a promise the realm had made to itself long ago, and then neglected. The neglect was visible in reports that the wall stood as it always had, immense and silent, but the institution that manned it had thinned to a fraction of its former strength. The Night's Watch survived more by tradition than by support. Supplies were irregular. Recruits were inadequate. Communication with the crown had become ceremonial rather than functional. Ned Stark did not respond with alarm. He responded with attention. The first change was administrative. The Night's Watch was brought back into regular correspondence with the crown. Reports were requested not only of manpower, but of morale, logistics, and patrol patterns. These inquiries were not framed as inspections, but as acknowledgements. The effect was immediate. To be asked implies relevance. Relevance restores purpose. Next came resources, and no grand influx of gold was announced. Instead, predictable support replaced sporadic charity. Food stores were allocated seasonally. Equipment was standardized. Requests were answered with explanations rather than silence. This predictability did not transform the watch overnight, but it stabilized it. Men who know when the next supply will arrive plan differently than those who do not. Perhaps most significantly, the wall regained political voice. The Lord Commander was invited to send representatives south, not as petitioners, but as participants. Their warnings were heard in council, even when they were not fully understood. Ned Stark did not insist that the South share his certainty about ancient threats. He insisted only that ignorance not be mistaken for safety. This insistence altered perception, but the wall ceased to be a symbol of exile alone. It became a frontier again. The idea that danger might originate from beyond politics unsettled a court accustomed to viewing conflict as a matter of banners and bloodlines. Yet Ned Stark did not dramatize these dangers. He presented them as risks to be managed, not legends to be feared. In doing so, he reframed the Night's Watch, not as a remnant of a forgotten age, but as an institution whose continued existence implied unfinished business. There was resistance, subtle but persistent. Some lords questioned the allocation of resources to a threat that had not manifested in generations. Others argued that the wall's purpose had shifted, that it now served primarily as a destination for criminals and dissidents. Ned Stark did not dispute this evolution. He acknowledged it, but he refused to let it define the Watch entirely. An institution degraded by neglect, he believed, could not be judged solely by its current state. The past still mattered. This philosophy extended to individuals. Among those at the wall was Jon Snow, whose presence there carried personal significance for the king. Ned Stark did not intervene in his son's path. He did not grant favor or exemption. Instead, he allowed Jon's reports, measured, observant, and increasingly concerned, to enter the same channels as any other. In this, there was both restraint and trust. The crown listened, not always with agreement, but with consistency. Over time, this attention produced subtle shifts. Patrols ventured farther. Old castles, long abandoned, were surveyed again. The Watch, still diminished, began to think in terms of defense rather than survival. Men trained not only to endure, but to observe. South of the wall, few noticed these changes immediately. That was the point. Ned Stark did not seek to alarm the realm with prophecies. He sought to prepare it quietly for the possibility that its greatest danger would not announce itself with banners. The stability that settled over Westeros did not end at its shores. Across the narrow sea, events continued to unfold with a momentum shaped by forces older and less patient than councils or crowns. Yet even there, beyond the immediate reach of law and banner, the consequences of a quieter realm were felt. In exile and uncertainty moved Daenerys Targaryen, carrying a name that had once ruled by fire and fear. Her early journey was marked by deprivation rather than ambition, by survival rather than strategy. Dragons came to her not as instruments of conquest, but as accidents of destiny. Fragile at first, more burden than weapon. What changed, subtly but decisively, was the world she looked toward. Westeros, under Ned Stark, did not fracture into the familiar chaos that exiles depend upon. There were no reports of open civil war, in no cities burned in succession, no banners rising and falling in rapid cycles. Power did not appear vacant. The Iron Throne, once an object of fevered speculation, became something steadier and therefore harder to seize. This altered the logic of return. In the cities of Essos, rumors arrived slowly and without urgency. They spoke not of cruelty, but of order. Not of weakness, but of restraint. For those who traded in mercenaries and promises, such rumors were discouraging. A stable realm does not hire saviors easily. It does not gamble on claimants whose legitimacy depends on unrest. Daenerys listened. Her understanding of power was still forming, shaped by loss and instruction rather than experience. She learned that conquest requires not only strength, but timing. That fire alone is insufficient when the land it seeks to rule is not already burning. This realization did not extinguish her claim, but it tempered it. Ambition, in the absence of opportunity, becomes patience. The dragons grew. They were symbols long before they were weapons. Proof of lineage, yes, but also reminders of a past the world had learned to fear. Merchants and magistrates regarded them with caution rather than reverence. To some, they represented leverage. To others, instability. Few saw them as inevitability. This ambiguity worked against haste. Daenerys found herself navigating alliances that were transactional rather than devoted. Support came with conditions, questions, and delays. The absence of immediate crisis in Westeros removed the urgency that might otherwise have propelled her westward prematurely. Instead, she remained in motion within Essos, learning governance not as theory, but as necessity. Cities fell under her influence not through terror alone, but through negotiation and reform. Each success order, once established, invites examination. As the realm settled into a quieter rhythm, institutions long accustomed to defining themselves against chaos found their purpose unsettled. Stability does not merely preserve power. It exposes its assumptions. Nowhere was this more evident than in the uneasy relationship between the crown, the great houses, and the faith of the Seven. Faith had always been both anchor and instrument in Westeros. It offered meaning to the common people and legitimacy to kings. But it also carried an independent authority, one rooted not in armies, but in belief. Previous rulers had alternated between appeasing it and exploiting it. Ned Stark did neither. His approach to faith was shaped by distance. Raised in the north, where gods were old and largely silent, Ned Stark regarded belief as a personal matter rather than a political tool. He did not seek endorsement from the faith, nor did he challenge its place in the lives of the people. This neutrality, though sincere, created ambiguity. When power does not define its relationship to belief, belief eventually defines its relationship to power. The first tension surfaced quietly. The High Septon, accustomed to ceremonial deference, found himself consulted rather than courted. Invitations replaced summons. Discussions replaced declarations. The faith's privileges were respected, but their expansion was curtailed. No new authority was granted, but none was revoked. This equilibrium was fragile, maintained through consistency rather than force. Among the lords, reactions varied. Some welcomed the king's restraint, viewing it as protection against religious overreach. Others feared that without clear boundaries, the faith might gradually reclaim influence lost over generations. Their concern was not unfounded. Institutions thrive in uncertainty, and the faith had learned patience well. Sermons began to shift in tone. They did not condemn the crown. Instead, they emphasized morality, duty, and the dangers of worldly compromise. These themes resonated in a realm weary of corruption. Honor, once associated primarily with houses and banners, was increasingly framed as a spiritual obligation. This reframing did not oppose the king directly, but it subtly repositioned authority. The crown observed, but did not intervene. Ned Stark understood that to confront belief is to dignify it as an adversary. Instead, he relied on example. the laws remained secular, where judgments were rendered without theological language. The separation was not announced. It was practiced. Over time, this consistency limited the faith's ability to claim moral supremacy over governance. Yet the tension revealed a deeper fault line. Honor, as Ned Stark understood it, was rigid but limited. It governed personal conduct, oaths, and responsibility. The faith's version of honor was expansive. It reached into intention, belief, and sin. Where these definitions overlapped, harmony followed. Where they diverged, conflict simmered. This divergence became apparent in matters of punishment. The faith advocated for moral correction through public repentance. Ned Stark preferred accountability through law. Neither approach was inherently cruel, but their coexistence demanded negotiation. Compromises were reached quietly, a case by case. No doctrine was declared victorious, but each compromise narrowed the space in which absolute authority could operate. The great houses watched carefully. Unity, when it exists, is rarely announced. It reveals itself through preparedness, through the quiet alignment of institutions that no longer work at cross purposes. By the time the realm began to sense the approach of a danger that did not negotiate, Westeros had already changed in ways difficult to reverse. The warnings arrived without drama. Reports from beyond the wall spoke of colder nights, of movements glimpsed at the edge of vision, of patterns that did not belong to raiders or beasts. Such accounts would once have been dismissed as superstition, filed away under the familiar category of northern exaggeration. Under Ned Stark, they were catalogued, compared, and quietly corroborated. No bells were rung. Instead, the Crown asked questions. The Night's Watch, long accustomed to shouting into silence, had found itself engaged in dialogue. Requests for men were not granted in bursts of enthusiasm, but through planned rotations. Supplies were increased incrementally. Old keeps were manned not as symbols of panic, but as redundancies. Preparedness, Ned Stark believed, should look indistinguishable from routine. This philosophy extended south. The great houses were not summoned to emergency councils. They were reminded through correspondence and precedent of their ancient obligations. Men were counted, roads repaired, grain reserves audited. These acts were framed not as responses to threat, but as responsible governance ahead of winter. Few objected. Preparation without fear provokes less resistance than mobilization under alarm. Even so, awareness spread. Among scholars and septons, old texts were revisited, where stories once treated as allegory were examined for pattern. The idea that the past might return, not as memory, but as presence unsettled many. Yet the absence of political chaos lent credibility to these discussions. When the realm is not distracted by its own divisions, it has space to consider external danger. The White Walkers were not named openly at first. Names carry power. Ned Stark understood that to give a threat its most frightening title is to accelerate panic. Instead, he spoke of unknowns, of forces not yet understood. This language preserved seriousness without inviting hysteria. Fear was allowed to exist, but not to govern. The North responded with a familiarity born of memory. Its people did not require persuasion to prepare for cold. They reinforced walls, conserved resources, and accepted the presence of soldiers without resentment. For them, winter was not metaphor. It was inheritance. The difference now was that the rest of the realm did not treat northern caution as provincial. For the first time in generations, the north was not alone in its vigilance. When contact finally came, when certainty replaced suspicion, it did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as confirmation. Scouts vanished. Patrols failed to return. What they left behind spoke not of defeat. Peace, when sustained, leaves few monuments. Its achievements are measured not in victories, but in absences. In wars not fought. In names not added to lists of the dead. In winters endured without collapse. When the long night receded, not as legend but as lived memory, the realm did not erupt in celebration. It exhaled, and in that long breath outward, the true cost of restraint began to surface. The reign of Ned Stark had preserved Westeros not through dominance, but through coherence. The Seven Kingdoms remained intact, not because fear compelled them to remain so, but because fragmentation had been made inconvenient, impractical, and culturally unfamiliar. This achievement, quiet as it was, carried consequences that only became visible once survival was assured. The first of these was exhaustion. A realm governed through responsibility demands participation. Lords accustomed to delegation through neglect had been required to engage continuously, with logistics, with communication, with consequence. Soldiers had fought not for glory, but for endurance. Administrators had labored under scrutiny rather than indulgence. When the immediate threat faded, weariness replaced urgency. This fatigue did not manifest as rebellion. It manifested as longing. There were whispers, not of overthrow, but of simplicity. Some remembered earlier reigns, brutal as they had been, as easier to understand. Fear, after all, clarifies priorities. Peace requires judgment, and judgment requires effort. In taverns and halls alike, the question arose quietly. Could such vigilance be sustained indefinitely? The king understood this question well. The Iron Throne, and never a place of comfort, had taken its toll. Ned Stark bore the marks of rule not on his body alone, but in his temperament. He spoke less, even than before. Decisions took longer, not from uncertainty, but from the accumulation of consequence. Each choice carried memory now, of lives preserved, of losses narrowly avoided, of compromises made to maintain unity. Good men, when they rule, do not escape guilt. They inherit it. The realm, too, had changed in ways that resisted reversal. Institutions once flexible through corruption had grown rigid through accountability. This rigidity brought stability, but also reduced adaptability. Innovation slowed. Risks were examined until their urgency dulled. The very habits that had enabled survival during crisis now made transformation difficult. Some saw this as stagnation. Others recognized it as maturity. Ned Stark did not attempt to resolve this debate. He had never believed that governance existed to perfect the realm. Its purpose, as he understood it, was preservation of life, of order, of of the fragile trust that allowed people to plan beyond the next season. His legacy, then, was not one of expansion or conquest. It was one of limitation. He demonstrated that power need not be loud to be effective, that authority could be exercised without spectacle, and that restraint, though costly, could outlast fear. Yet this example carried an implicit warning. Such a model depends upon character. It cannot be systematized fully, nor enforced upon successors. The question that lingered was not whether his reign had succeeded. It was whether it could be repeated. As time passed, but the realm began to understand that peace, governed by conscience, is vulnerable, not to enemies alone, but to memory itself. Future generations, spared the immediacy of threat, might mistake restraint for weakness, patience for indecision. They might forget why quiet governance had mattered. Ned Stark accepted this inevitability. He had never sought to shape eternity. He had sought only to carry the realm through its darkest passage intact. If the future chose differently, that would be its burden to bear. When his reign eventually ended, there were no great upheavals. Power transferred without blood. The institutions he had steadied continued, imperfectly, without him. Some reforms endured, others softened. This too was expected. No peace remains pure once its architect departs. Yet history, in its slower accounting, remembered one thing clearly. In a world that rewarded cruelty and celebrated ambition, a man ruled briefly through honor and left the realm standing, not triumphant, not transformed beyond recognition, simply alive. And sometimes, in the long night of history, survival is the rarest victory of all.